Okay, so I'm going to continue into Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and the Angel Out Ahead. And I'm up to chapter 5, Ta'wil and Prophetic Philosophy, and it's from page 162 in the it's in the first section, which is called I think, Key to the Soul and Key to the World. And so what we've been talking about is Ivan Illich and David Abram, and the idea of sort of sacred reading, and the connection between sacred reading, hermeneutics, phenomenology through Heidegger. What else? Yeah, so the importance of this is, I think, to Corbin, the idea that the imagination, or sort of by extension, the role of the imagination in imaginal practice can be purified and, in a sense, cleansed, and to be made more pure and clear, in a way that can help us to practice, sort of embodying the distinction between fantasy and the imaginal. And so I think this would be fair to say is what is regarded as a sort of the importance of this kind of reading, at least in part. And we were also talking about sort of the problems that arose with the sort of origin of the more vowel-centered Greek alphabet, where in a language such as Arabic, where there aren't any vowels, one has to literally like breathe more life, and so substance and body into the texts, such as the Quran. And so this kind of a more embodied and lived articulation of revelation is more sort of automatic or yeah, present. Anyway, so I'm wanting to move on into this. I was making a key sort of distinction last time that there's a sort of process and product argument where, yes, by sort of going back to these sacred texts, that there might be something important about that. There might be also something separately important about the process that gave rise to those kinds of sacred texts, and the purifying quality of sacred reading aside, we wouldn't want to ignore the importance of a sort of revelation for its own sake, and the process that gives rise to it, which may include but should not be reduced to the significance of writings that have been with us for a very long time, or may which otherwise be inaccessible to us because of, for example, language barriers. Cheetham continues, the story that Illich and Abram tell of the phenomenology of the text is perhaps only one way in which the connection to the word may be lost. In whatever form it takes, the loss of connection between the external, public form of the book and the meaning hidden within it gives rise to a drama common to all the religions of the book. Okay, so what he's talking about is that again, when we lose this practice of sacred reading, when we lose access to the phenomenology of the text, then we actually lose connection to the word, to the logos, you know, whether we conceive of that as embodied in the Quran or in Christ, you know, there's an idea that if our regard for religious practice is only toward the sort of outward forms, if we lose our inner connection to that which we're in deep connection with, right? If it loses its transformative power, then well, that's a problem, and that's you know, that's why we're so sort of spiritually, you know, messed up. It's because we lose a living inner connection. And clearly, yes, the phenomenology of text is only one way that sort of shows up through, for example, the technical innovation of the alphabet. We now get a quote from Corbin, who says, if the true meaning of this book is the interior meaning, hidden under the literal appearance, From the moment that men fail to recognize or refuse this interior meaning, from that moment, they destroy the integrity of the word, of the logos, and then begins the drama of the lost speech. Cheetham continues, from the moment we refuse the interiority of the text or of the world, then the world is turned inside out. The task of hermeneutics is to recover this living, integral word, and through this, to make possible the event at the edge of the exoteric cosmos that is the quote, great inversion. Okay, so I think we have here simply the notion that the world has been turned inside out already by our refusal of the capacity for self-transformation within our interiority. And if we can recover that through, for example, sacred reading, the idea that those texts might actually have something to say to us, you know, big news. But then not only texts, much as I like texts, but the world itself. So the world is a source of living revelation. And again, Corbin's notion is that this makes possible a certain event, uh, an event of capitalized as a kind of great inversion that I think Cheetham is talking about as the world turned inside out, turning it back out the right way again. And the implication is through epiphany, through revelation, through self-realization, through transformation. Cheetham continues. Corbin's understanding of Islamic spirituality, and in the end, any spirituality, is centered on a characteristically Shi'ite notion of hermeneutics, spiritual exegesis, or Ta'wil. Again, sorry if I mispronounced that. I hope I can be forgiven for that. Corbin says, it is the most characteristic mental operation of all our spirituals, Neoplatonists, Ishraqiyun, Sufis, Ismailian theosophists. It finally appears as the mainspring of every spirituality, in the measure to which it furnishes the means of going beyond all conformisms, all servitudes to the letter, all opinions accepted ready-made. Yeah, okay, so here Corbin is just emphasizing the importance of this kind of spiritual exegesis, having a direct personal connection with what is regarded as the word, whether it be, again, the Quran or Christ or whatever it is. Again, he's emphasizing the personal connection. In a footnote, William Chittick points out that Corbin's conception of the term Ta'wil is exclusively Shiite, and that this led him to misconstrue Ibn Arabi's position, as well as perhaps that of Sunni Islam in general. Yeah, so basically Corbin is not impartial. Corbin is very Shiite in orientation. Cheetham continues, while it is not tied to the formulations of official exoteric dogma, this Ta'wil is neither arbitrary nor unconstrained. Okay. The claim is that there is a kind of dogma or ordering here about how such hermeneutic is to be done that is not arbitrary or unconstrained, but is nevertheless not exoteric. This here being construed as a good thing. I think the couple of risks just in passing would be that there are kinds of internal dogma, right? Or internal constraints that can be profoundly harmful, or lack thereof, lack of internal constraints that can be profoundly harmful. And exoteric dogma, can also be profoundly beneficial and important. And so simply replacing exoteric dogma with esoteric dogma that shouldn't uh, obscure the importance of exoteric dogma, and it shouldn't blind us to the risks of esoteric or internal, quote unquote, dogma. Corbin nevertheless states, we are concerned with spiritual hermeneutics that are rigorous, systematic, and highly complex, in full possession of method, and vivified by a spirituality that cannot be ignored if there is a true desire to interpret. For that is the actual meaning of the Greek word hermenia, hermeneutics. Okay, that's just saying the same thing. So Cheetham says, Ta'wil does not construct anything. Rather, a multidimensional world is discovered, quote, by virtue of a principle of equilibrium and harmony. A multi-dimensional world is discovered. Okay, well, that's super interesting to me because it comports directly with Jung, with Pythagoras, with Heidegger. And I guess I think the ultimate claim would have to be, yes, we can appreciate the importance of having an esoteric or sort of interiorized connection with this discovery. But as per, I would say, Jung and Pythagoras, there is a sort of, I would call, archetypal world order, archetypes here being equivalent to angels, or intermediary order that structures both psyche, meaning interiority, and cosmos, meaning exteriority. Archetypes as a general ordering principle, or angels as a general ordering principle. And that fact, right, that claim, is not merely esoteric, although it doesn't obviate the central importance of the esoteric, because it's not exoteric either. Again, it's hard to imagine something that could be both, Corbin states, in Islamic Gnosis, the balance signifies the equilibrium between light and darkness. The visible aspect of a being presupposes its equilibration by an invisible and celestial counterpart. The apparent and exoteric, or zahir, is equilibrated by the occulted and esoteric, or batin. Okay, so there's a couple of different polarities all through there. Again, we have the esoteric and the exoteric, whereas here the esoteric is identified with the spiritual and celestial and invisible, and the exoteric is sort of identified with the apparent or more earthly, more visible, and that's all fine. But again, there are going to be mistakes. We also had obviously with light and darkness, and so look, okay, so I have to do a little bit of mapping here. So I guess Jung pointed out that the problem with the sort of light and darkness in Christianity is that light ends up being conceived as how well we can imitate Christ, and whereas darkness is the sort of our inability to do that, conceived as sin or moral weakness, and that ultimately means that the Christian image of wholeness is not effective enough in a way because it's impossible to imitate his perfection, quote unquote. And so the problem here is this that light and darkness in what Corbin is saying again gets reified where the esoteric is regarded as what is light and what is dark is the material, the corporeal, the visible or exoteric, conceived of as the forces of Ahriman. And while an element of that is true, it is also true the other way, meaning that if you want to project the light and darkness split, you also need to project that in the other way, in that there can be esoteric and indeed transpersonal sources of darkness, and that that which is exoteric and sort of visible and apparent can be a source of light. So, for example, an obvious way of putting that would be that the groups make more sense and individuals are very subject to psychosis, blah, blah. And that's why we have, for example, science. It's kind of what science is about. The idea that that's valuable. It's a Okay, but if we want to step out of the light and darkness bit, then we have to say that if we just focus on the sort of esoteric and exoteric distinction that's being invoked, then yeah, I would say again, all these dualities we need to be able to inhabit both sides and to take perspectives on both sides. That roughly seems obvious. I think all I would want to say is, let me see. All I wanted to do was press on the implication that associates esoteric with individual and exoteric with the collective. So what we want to do is restore again to the ecology of practices and community of practitioners. Yes, exoteric individual practice, but also groups. The idea that um, I mean, I won't go on about it here, but the whole point is that there can be this deep connection in practice between the esoteric and the group, and that by extension, um, one's more individual, quote unquote, way of life can be comparatively more exoteric. The idea that there are certain forms of, let's say, gnosis, revelation, that are only accessible in group contexts. This is obviously missed if we simply, as introverts, let's say, identify the exoteric with the collective and with the all the stupid people, then that's not that's not the way, man. All right. Cheetham continues. Anyway, I'll shut up, but I was just like, yes, Ta'wil does not construct anything. It's rather a multi-dimensional world is discovered by virtue of a principle of equilibrium and harmony that I've been trying to point to the different dimensions of. If you really want equilibrium and harmony, you have to be able to identify these different polarities and work with all the binaries. And that's sort of being gestured to by Corbin, but not, I would say, in practice fulfilled. Anyway, Cheetham continues. All things visible are kept in harmony by the counterweight provided by the correspondences between the spiritual and corporeal worlds. That's interesting. The idea is that everything that is visible is sort of already kept in that harmony by these counterweights that we sort of haven't noticed. And sort of be that as it may, like it's all very well to sort of notice that, but this could be a sort of way of this is actually how everything is. But I'm like, yeah, but everything, the way that everything is still kind of messed up. So what gives? Anyway, all visible things are kept in harmony by, as in how harmonious are they really? All visible things are kept in harmony by the counterweight provided by the correspondences between the spiritual and corporeal worlds. Correct. And the science of the balance is the Ta'wil. It is akin to alchemy. For, correct, the balance is the principle that measures the intensity of the soul's desire during its descent through matter. The balance is the principle that measures the intensity of the soul's desire during its descent through matter. It is the alchemist's task to measure the desire of the soul of the world. Um, this is one way of conceiving of the alchemist's task. Again, through Jung, I might understand that sort of alchemical or Gnostic traditions are sort of embodying this undercurrent or compensating undercurrent to the Christian mainstream. And this is part of its significance is because it's sort of holding, let's say, certain archetypal structures that are important to reaccessing gnosis and revelation, and that alchemy can be understood. I mean, I've published on this a lot. Can be understood as sort of metaphorical way of bringing forward certain archetypal structures that we can simply understand as metaphor and symbol and take them up. The idea here being that, look, the point is, who is the alchemist to measure the desire of the soul of the world? Who are we to measure the soul of the world? The point of the alchemist is to release or liberate the soul of the world, not to measure it. would seem to me very ironic if we're trying to escape Descartes. Literally, look, literally, when Descartes was coming up with his whole deal, an angel appeared to him in a dream and said, the conquest of the world of matter is to be achieved through number and measure. And that actually happened. Literally, an angel appeared to Descartes in a dream. And it's like, yeah, okay, if we're trying to escape the trap that comes along with the benefits of the scientific perspective, then we don't want to start conceiving the role of the alchemist is to measure the desire of the soul of the world. This is an extremely hubristic take on the task of the alchemist. In any case, there is a balance that apparently measures the intensity of the soul's desire. Cheetham continues, the science of the balance affirms the ontological necessity of the counterweight provided by the other world through an analogical form of knowledge. That raises up the beings it perceives, following the gradations of the hierarchy of the worlds. It is, quote, it is not theory, it is an initiation to vision. Okay, I might simply move on from that because I don't want to be here all day. I think I would say that we know that there's a profound role for analogical reasoning, and this is close to the core of human cognition. It's from the Human Origins playlist. And I can see how the idea of a balance sort of that comports with Taoism. Um, and then the idea that analogical reasoning can sort of reveal or point to this quote unquote other world, or what is conceived to be the upper, the abstract, or the spiritual, the heavenly. That makes sense to me. The idea that it's an ontological necessity to have that counterweight, like maybe, I mean, I'm not in the position to evaluate that claim. So let's continue. I mean, yeah, the questions here are about relevance. Okay, so like if we understand that there is a harmony that's already kept between things, like maybe um, I'm open to that, but it's kind of like how does that show up in the practice as being relevant, if at all? The implication, it seems to be that in this practice of sort of prophetic reading, what's understood as Ta'wil, hermeneutics or spiritual exegesis, that this balance is discovered, is aletheically unveiled in the Heideggerian way. And that could help us to appreciate the complexity of the existing harmonies that go on in the world, to appreciate what makes things the way that they are. That could be profoundly beneficial in the sense of pushing the values of the right hemisphere along more. From McGilchrist again. Um, yes, it very much wouldn't necessarily help us to, if it's about discovering the order of the way things already are, it's not necessarily about um, escaping the abyss, because the way that things already are is kind of messed up, in case anyone is playing along at home. The risk here is, look, the risk is the risk of spiritual bypassing, because I see the same thing, for example, in there's an after school video, It's All Perfect with Ramdas, and this is sort of Ramdas goes to India and then he meets a guru, and the guru is like, oh, can't you see that it's all perfect? And it's like, yeah, but from a human point of view, it's kind of not. And that's profoundly both ways, because it's like this the spiritual vision in a way of the underlying unity and harmony can be a profound spiritual resource that we can draw on to recognize the perfection of the way that things are. You have to savor the world before you can try to save it. But it can also be a source of bypassing in that if we then don't come down and among back toward materiality and the profoundly not balanced condition, then we're kind of not showing up. I'll leave that there. Cheetham continues. The experience of this hermeneutics is interior, but not subjective, since it is just by means of the spiritual birth that Ta'wil signals that the world opens to reveal its divine face. Ta'wil is a kind of meditative, imaginative thinking that proceeds by means of images, not concepts. Okay, that's helpful. It's deeply relying on cognition involving image, but is apparently not just subjective. So that would need to be explored. So, like, in what way is it not just subjective? The notion that the world is like that and that it can reveal itself. Okay. Corbin states, the way of reading and of comprehending to which I refer presupposes, in the strict sense of the word, a theosophia. That is, the mental or visionary penetration of an entire hierarchy of spiritual universes that are not discovered by means of syllogisms, because they do not reveal themselves except through a certain mode of cognition, a hieronosis, that unites the speculative knowledge of traditional information to the most personal interior experience. For in the absence of the latter, technical models alone would be transmitted, and these would be doomed to a rapid decline. Yeah, so that's fine, but again, it would seem to me to be pretty easy to get lost in a hierarchy of spiritual universes. And is there anything else here? I'm sure that there was. Oh, the idea that first of all, the relevance of such spiritual universes may be questionable. It may be not. It might be might be a question of not yet. Like yes, but there are more pressing matters to attend to, perhaps, because again, there are certain questions like what's the role of different spiritual universes? Like why be interested in them? And I'm just very conscious of the lotus eating trap. And the other question would be, if we assume that such spiritual universes, for example, can be profoundly beneficial and useful, can we imagine a way of, let's say, accessing them that is not dependent on the elitist activity of reading and comprehending in this way? And can it be brought down into a practice which is democratizable and shareable and livable? And as far as I can tell, that remains to be seen. But it may well be possible. I think I'm to understand that the spiritual universes have the relevance of being sort of different stations along the way of the development of the individual soul, maybe the collective soul, that this constitutes their relevance, that we can understand these sort of spiritual universes as a kind of mode of presence. And it's like, okay, that's one way of understanding it, perhaps. And so I can see how that it can be relevant in that way. Cheetham says, it is the basis of prophetic philosophy as a whole. Oh, it, as in Ta'wil, as in this kind of, quote, meditative, imaginative thinking that proceeds by means of images, not concepts. It is the basis of prophetic philosophy as a whole. For without this living word, in the presence only of the literal letter of the law, there can be no true philosophy. Corbin says, from the very beginning, Shiite thinking has given sustenance to a prophetic type of philosophy, which corresponds to a prophetic religion. A prophetic philosophy presupposes a type of thought which does not allow itself to be bound either by the historical past or by the letter of the dogmatic form, in which the teachings of this past are consolidated, or by the limits imposed by the resources and laws of rational logic. Well, I certainly see the importance of all of this. So the idea is to sort of restore a deeper practice of philosophy, restore our access to the living word, to understand the importance of this sort of esoteric meaning of profound texts. That's all profoundly valuable. I think like in again in group practice, what I'm seeking is for a way that the sort of collective processes can be deeply also tied to the individual experience that is equivalent to what's being talked about here. Um, so I do think that's all profoundly valuable, right? But there are again also risks of narcissism, sort of being, in Buddhism they would probably say those are the lesser lights. It's like, oh look, I learned how to see meditative images. It's like great, but good for you, man. Um, it's I mean that's pretty harsh criticism, but yeah, it's kind of like you have to have an attunement toward again the quote is that like if it can't be yes to individual development, yes, right, but the point is that there may be collective processes, forms of participation, involvement in the collective. There may be affordances unlocked within that to our own development that are only unlocked in that context, that are only available in that context. And the importance of that should not be forgotten. Because in a dogma, in a constraint, like what I'm saying is that inner freedom can actually be inner constraint. And that we think we're freeing ourselves into this stuff, and in fact we're freeing ourselves into our own universe, which is definitely a kind of, it depends what context you're in, right? But it's very difficult to conceive of the exoteric and the esoteric, or the collective and the individual as going together in this sort of opponent processing reciprocal opening kind of way. Finally, we would have to also question the value of freedom as an absolute value, as in freedom for what? If it's freedom to dissolve in a haze of different spiritual universes, then how is that other than a refined form of hedonism or selfishness? I don't know. Maybe I'm just too much of a modern person. Cheetham says, this freedom of the poesis of spiritual birth in a kind of counterpoint to the constraints of the letter of prophetic revelation is emphasized again and again in Corbin's writings. And it is only by holding firmly to this that we can come to understand the true meaning of a prophetic philosophy for him. For him. Everything depends upon the interiorization and true interpretation of revelation. And this in turn depends upon the cosmic correspondences revealed by the science of the balance. Visible reality has its complement, its completion in the other world. Ta'wil, which is this practice of meditative, imaginative thinking in relation to sort of prophetic philosophy and reading the word, must be understood as one half of a pair. Ta'wil and Ta'wil-Tanzil. I mean, people must be so annoyed that I'm talking about this in such a disrespectful way, but it's just one opinion. Okay, so I think I would have to say in passing that through this kind of poesis, it may be well possible to achieve a kind of freedom through spiritual birth, but there are other kinds of virtues other than freedom that are also important, and things and sort of aspects of development other than quote unquote spiritual birth that are conspicuously neglected in this case that I've been trying to point to all the way throughout. For example, shadow work, for example, work with groups, for example, the world situation. I don't know, maybe we could sort of have something to say or do about it rather than just sort of bypassing it completely. And so when he says sort of everything depends upon the interiorization and true interpretation of revelation, I'm like, everything, really? Because I like, yes, I can see the profound value of interiorization in the way that we've been talking about. I can see the importance of revelation and its proper both interpretation and sort of evocation. But if there are to be sort of objective aspects of this, and again in group practice, this sort of thing, then more is important than interiorization. Also, the exteriorization of the soul is also can be considered to be valuable. Although, of course, you have to be careful about that as well. Okay, but then there's a further idea that the kind of interiorization and interpretation of revelation that's being talked about quote, depends upon the cosmic correspondences revealed by the science of the balance. We would have to ask further questions about that, like in what way? Yeah, in what way is it dependent on that? Okay, so it seems that, hang on, I'm really just trying to understand here. So it seems that like this, um, it's a notion of everything sort of being in pairs that have a sort of exoteric or earthly and esoteric or sort of celestial aspects or poles. And so that the idea is that the proper practice of this kind of turning the world inside out that Corbin is talking about, that Cheetham is talking about, and quote, the true interpretation of revelation is dependent upon or involves a practice of noticing or revealing or unconcealing these quote cosmic correspondences. Um, and so if we simply accept that for the moment and say, okay, perhaps it would be possible for the practice as is being talked about by Corbin to depend on these correspondences. We don't understand how yet, or perhaps why. But if that's the case, then the practice of Ta'wil, which is the kind of sacred reading that is being prophetic philosophy that's being talked about, is itself one half of a pair. And now they're trying to designate the other half, which is called Tanzil. Corbin states, Tanzil properly designates positive religion, the letter of the revelation dictated to the prophet by the angel. It is to cause the descent of this revelation from the high world. Ta'wil is etymologically and inversely to cause to return, to lead back, to restore to one's origin, and to the place where one comes home. Consequently, to return to the true and original meaning of a text. So I think here I would say that revelation can be understood as a bridge, and that one, by sort of interpreting revelation and letting it play out in the interiority, one can ascend, back to our sort of spiritual home. The idea being that from the source of revelation, that it can be a bridge downwards towards descent. And as per Jacob's ladder and in Jung's dreams and many other places, both are important. And different people may be sort of called to different directions by temperament or whatever else. But this is Platonic anagoge, up and out of the cave and then back down into the cave successively. It depends on what perspective you take up. If you take up the perspective of the sort of earthly, then sort of via the revelation which is pre-existing, one can sort of return to spiritual home. But if you are able to take up the perspective of that celestial angel, then revelation is itself possible, I would say, and is therefore a bridge down, which is sort of equally valuable, but in the other way. Cheetham states, the phenomenologies of harmony and equilibrium expressed by descent and return, descent going down and return going up, are expressed in other ways by other conjoined terms of fundamental importance. And now we get another quote from Corbin, who states, and again, I'm really apologize for the pronunciation. I'm doing my best I'm far afield here. So majaz is figure, metaphor, while hakikat is the truth that is real, the reality that is true, the essence, the idea. But let us note well that the spiritual meaning to be disengaged from the letter is not to be thought of as constituting a metaphorical meaning. It is the letter itself that is the metaphor. The Ta'wil causes the letter to regress to its true and original meaning. The same is true of the pair of terms zahir and batin. Zahir is the exoteric, the apparent, the patency of the letter, the law, the text of the Quran. Zahir holds the same relationship to batin as majaz does to hakikat. The Ta'wil must lead it back to the hidden reality, to the esoteric truth, with which it symbolizes. Okay, so I don't know enough about these terms to unpack that at all. So I'll simply leave that there and say we've been talking about this again, phenomenologies of harmony and equilibrium expressed in terms of descent and return or ascent. And there's a sort of process of practice of revelation and philosophical reading, sacred reading, prophetic philosophy, hermeneutics in terms of interpreting the living word, that are understood as sort of ta'wil or going back up to the original meaning, and tanzil or coming down from the revelation coming down. And I would understand revelation itself as a kind of bridge. And so processes in either direction. And then these terms all seem to be somewhat, at the moment, equivalent in that kind of balancing. Yeah, so there's a way that one of the pair, the sort of upper of the pair, is sort of more symbolical, more imaginal, more metaphorical in a sense, more spiritual, higher, heavenly, more abstract, more visionary. And this is, for example, majaz or zahir, whereas the other, so the lower of the two is sort of more, again, more earthly, more concrete, more apparent, more literal, more exoteric. And this is uh, correspondingly sort of hakikat and batin. Again, symbols as bridge. Okay, so now I'm able to move on a little. Cheetham states, quote, to enter into this cosmology, we must see that the most fundamental premises that underlie the modern meaning of reading and of text are no more valid here than a narrowly linguistic term, than a narrowly linguistic use of the term hermeneutics. Metaphor, hermeneutics, and the literal meaning are not literary concepts for the same reason that the angelic hierarchies are not anthropomorphic. Our presence is, this is the claim, right? Our presence is a dim reflection of the angel. And, quote, poetic metaphor derives its truth and its energy from the levels of meaning and the correspondences within a world perceived as symbol. From the powers of the angels to draw beings upward. From the desire of the soul of the world. Okay, there's a couple of brief points there that I want to make. Like that's fine with all of that. Only to say that yes, the angels have this power for us to draw us upwards, but there could be sort of a corresponding movement that they sort of the angels what they want is sort of expression in and through us, and this is a sort of descending direction, which is different again. And then the other one being that sort of in that the human is a sort of this was that was sort of expressed in terms of this relationship between quote unquote the sort of human, or we could say the lower aspect of the soul, and the celestial aspect of the soul, the divine soul or angels. And another way of putting it is the relationship between sort of soul of the world as anima mundi, and let's say God, which is different. And so the idea that the humans can be, in some sense, a sort of mediating layer between the soul of the world, desiring to sort of ascend, earth angel in this way, um, and correspondingly a revelation down from on high to toward the soul of the world. So that's a kind of sort of more I would talk about those two as sort of a microcosm and macrocosm sort of structure. Again, there's a sort of individualized personal relationship between sort of higher and lower aspects of the soul that is maybe mirrored on a sort of cosmic or macrocosmic plane. Just in passing, Chris Beisch corroborates that. Cheetham continues, Ta'wil applies not only to reading the text of a book, but to the interpretation of the cosmic text as well, since the cosmos itself is the primordial revelation. Okay, I like that very much. The idea of the world as itself a divine book is central to Islamic cosmology. That's super interesting. The idea being that if we're sort of stuck reading text all the time, then we've taken it too literally, taken it too literally in it's like taken it in a too literary way. That's so interesting. We get a quote from Nasser who says, "The order of nature is seen in the Islamic perspective to derive, according to divine wisdom, from the prototype of all existence in the divine order." I might repeat that. The order of nature is seen in the Islamic perspective to derive, according to divine wisdom, from the prototype of all existence in the divine order. The prototype which is identified according to the language of Quranic cosmology with the pen and the guarded tablet. Fascinating. God wrote by means of the pen, which symbolizes the active principle of creation. The realities of all things upon the guarded tablet, which remains eternally with him, while through the cosmogenic act, the realities written upon the tablet were made to descend to lower levels of existence and finally to the world of nature. I think I'll not comment as obviously a Freudian reading. And I think, look, there's some validity to that because again, I would say that through, look, it's not that this, I would regard this as untrue, not at all, deeply true, right? But, well, yeah, I mean, it's a sense the masculine and the feminine are very deep structures, and we're going to see that expressed religiously, of course. So I can't exactly deny that. What I would say in passing is that, again, through sort of Jordan Hall and the example of the Sibian project is one among others. Civilization is an inherently unstable form, and that since the Holocene, since we started living in a sedentary way, um, we've been sort of fundamentally imbalanced in sort of all aspects of our sort of societies, including our religions and cultures, that we see expressed, for example, in the patriarchal trend, the trend towards the spiritual being considered to be the divinization of the relationship between father and son. Um, and we would see that, I think, and we do see that played out in the monotheistic traditions, which have maybe a part of the picture, but not the whole picture of the divinity that is. So I would say sort of I'm saying a yes and more. There's a lot. I mean, there's quite a lot to the revelation of the world. The primordial revelation. Anyway, what I'm getting at is that if we're really serious about this stuff, about hey, we've been sort of living in an imbalanced way since the longest time ago, and everything that's happened since then has been within that fall, then we're going to see that the truths that have arrived since that time are reflective of sort of deep eternal truths and also expressive of the fallen condition, which I've conceived here as a kind of imbalance toward what I've pointed to. And I think I would say that we see that reflected here, which is why I've said yes and. Cheetham says, the Ta'wil only affects transformation because it transmutes the world into symbols that by their very nature transcend the distinction between the outer and the inner, the subject and the object. And by interiorizing the cosmos, by revealing the imago mundi, transform and lead the soul beyond the literal understanding of the world and its truth to its meaning with the angel, to its meeting with the angel. Okay, I can definitely see that that sort of comports with a lot of Jung in terms of stuff about synchronicity, sort of symbolic readings, symbol as allegory, symbolic language, symbolic logic. Great. But I think we also see, again, if you're sort of just one guy doing that, then you're kind of the crazy guy at the edge of the village, and um, I'll have to leave that there because I'm just repeating myself at this point. So yeah, again, groups can can we yeah, the power of collective intelligence is I would say greater um, in regards to sort of symbolic logic, symbolic language, and so on. Corbin states, beneath the idea of exegesis appears that of the guide, the exegete. And beneath the idea of an exegesis, we glimpse that of an exodus, aha, of a departure from Egypt, which is an exodus from metaphor and the slavery to the letter, from exile and the occident of exoteric appearance to the orient of the original and hidden idea. Cheetham continues, the fundamental structure of reality takes the form of descent, coming down through Tanzil, and return through Ta'wil or ascent. Quote, the world is distant from the divine to the extent that it is trapped in the dogmatic, the fixed, the literal, to the extent that we can only see the apparent, the letter. When the soul can stand at the edge of the cosmos and see that cosmos and everything in it, and see that cosmos and everything in it as symbolic of that which is hidden, of the inner meaning that leads to a flowering of the world, then the true meaning of the text has been seen. And the return has begun. And this experience is in each case unique. And in each case, the guide, the exegete, is the angel, the quote, Kadir of your being. Right. So that was there's a confusion from earlier where the whole point of having this quote inner spiritual guide or Kadir was that it was supposed to purify the imagination to help us distinguish between fantasy and reality. And that was supposed to be in service of sort of from out of that purified imagination, then cultivating the relationship between higher and lower aspects of the soul or earthly soul and divine double. And now it's being understood that now I'm understanding that the divine double and the Qadir are actually the same figure. Maybe I'm still getting it wrong. Maybe they are actually different. But if I'm right, and it is in fact the case, then I would say that's inconsistent and frustrating. What else do I want to say here? Yeah, it's sort of okay. Well, I see what they're getting at, right? There's this sort of um, association between, let me see, the fixed, the literal, and the dogmatic. But yeah, I think I mean, it's true, right? The world is distant from the divine to the extent that it's trapped in the dogmatic and the fixed and literal in a way. But I would have to also understand that the dogmatic, fixed, and literal are all emanations or expressions of the divine too. So again, I would have to say yes and so the descent is equally important and orientation to that descent is equally important. That's kind of why we're here in a way. I don't know that we're here to return home again. In a way, I feel that returning home is sort of, yeah, maybe it is an important part of it. Maybe I think that's what the individual wants, right? To return home. But it's like my point is that it's not all about us, friends. It's not all about the individual. The whole point is to sort of get out of our own head. Like, can we, through the practice of gnosis, recover our sense of spiritual home and then help out and then help other people, right? It's because the Gnostic temptation here just to escape up and out of the world is so tempting. But I'm probably still misunderstanding something. We can see that there is a trap of dogmatic, fixed, and literal deeply. But I also see traps in the other direction, which is why dialectic, which is why dialogos, which is why, the synthesis of opposites, which is, I've talked about that a lot. We have to be able to take both sides of any different duality that can be named. The dogmatic is only defined as such in contradistinction to, I would say that yeah, if we're calling other people or a certain way, hey, over there is the dogma. And I'm not dogmatic. I would call that perspective itself a kind of dogma. Not that it's untrue, but that it's a partial truth. I'll just finish off. Cheetham states, if this is true for each knower, then a prophetic theory of knowledge, or gnosisology, gnosiology. If this is true for each knower, then a prophetic theory of knowledge or gnosiology must understand all true knowledge as homologous to the revelation. A prophetic theory or gnosiology must understand all true knowledge as homologous to the revelation to the prophet, and all mystic returns as mimetic of the night of the mirage. Okay, that brings up homology and mimesis and archetype by extension. I would point to Gary Clark, Carl Jung, and the Evolutionary Sciences, which talks about homology and archetype. Anyway, for Mulla Sadra, this culminates in a full-blown epistemology, which, quote, embraces simultaneously the knowledge of the philosophers, of those who are inspired, and of the prophets, as as graduated variations of one and the same manifestation. Quote, all true knowledge is theophany. Quote, the angel of knowledge and the angel of revelation are ultimately the same. And it is this same angel who is individualized in a way that is in each case unique, and through whom the prophetic poetic couple is joined. Corbin states, because what is involved is the same manifestation at different levels of eminence, whether by means of the senses or in some other way, a manifestation whose highest form is the vision of the angel, projecting knowledge into the heart in a waking state. In a vision similar to the vision of the eyes, It could be said that the philosopher does not see the angel, but intelligizes through him to an extent which depends upon his own efforts. The imams hear him through spiritual audition. The prophets see him. It could be said that the philosopher does not see the angel, but intelligizes through him to an extent which depends upon his own efforts. The imams hear him through spiritual audition. The prophets see him. Quote, this is Cheetham. This knowledge as theophany is necessarily hidden, occulted. That is what ensures that it is in each case unique, because it concerns each soul individually. And that is what protects its very nature as sacred. What safeguards the sacred knowledge of this, what safeguards the sacred nature of this knowledge is precisely that it is hidden. In our time, quote, the divine presence is veiled. Quote, and because it is incognito, because it is incognito, it can never become an object or a thing. And it defies all socialization of the spiritual. Again, quote, this knowledge as theophany is necessarily hidden, occulted, necessarily. That is what ensures that it is in each case unique, because it concerns each soul individually. And that is what protects its very nature as sacred. What safeguards the sacred nature of this knowledge is precisely that it is hidden. In our time, the divine presence is veiled, quote, and because it is incognito, it can never become an object or a thing, and it defies all socialization of the spiritual. Quote, that which is common to all cannot be sacred. That which is common to all cannot be sacred. It can only point to it as symbol to symbolized. Okay, well, that's where it's going to stop for the moment. So, wow. Well, there's obviously a lot here. So I'll have to make a few comments at the end here. One of them will be, of course, I wouldn't want to deny the importance of hidden knowledge. There is some knowledge which is necessarily hidden by virtue of its being accessible to the individual, right? And I would absolutely want to regard that as sacred. I noticed that there's a way that because that, let's say, knowledge or theophany is necessarily hidden or occulted, our regard, our evaluation of it is in some way independent to that. Um, as in whether we regarded it as sacred or not would not change the fact that it were hidden, because it's like the fact that there can be sort of an individualized spiritual ascent is true, right? Is in fact the case. And it may be necessary to regard that knowledge as sacred in order to participate in that quest. But I think what I'm getting at here is what I'm getting at is the tragedy of the commons. So the tragedy of the commons, I mean, I'm not the first person to point to this, right? This is so what about ecology? What about the rest of creation? Like what about all of it? What about the whole? And I think we see here whether it be the tragedy of the commons or the arms races on deployment of new technologies or arms races on weapons technologies, for example, they're all examples of multipolar traps where the best thing to do for the individual is to profane the commons. And the finding a solution to that is one of the, I would say, conditions, requirements for shepherding us, safeguarding us through this time, our time. Then you can sort of say, time doesn't exist. What about the eternal? And I'm kind of saying the commons is eternal. So the commons as the source, the wellspring, the pool. There is a void, which is common, very common. So common is to be unnoticeable. And again, quote, that which is common to all cannot be sacred. It can only point to it as symbol to symbolized. Do you see what I mean? So the question may be as yeah, where do we put the term sacred? What do we mean by that term? Do we have to, as Eliade did, does it have to be sacred and profane, which is a bit of a risk, or there's a challenge, there's a problem here. So I guess what I'm saying is yes to everything that's been said, and also what about the descending direction? What about the idea of being spiritually resourced and then coming sort of down and among to help out? What about the imminent? What about the apparent? The actual? What about the world? I have to leave it there. I think I've made my point. I guess, yeah, so finally I would just say that like, yeah, to the degree that we sort of hark back to cosmologies and you know, spiritual hierarchies and religious, models of spiritual development and so on that have existed, you know, since they've been invented, they've come to being after the origins of metacrisis, meaning crisis, then they're going to reflect that. And they're going to reflect that by pointing in the opposite direction, as in rather than sacralizing the commons, which is kind of what we need, kind of what we're lacking. It's regarded as that it cannot be sacred. Um, but then, yeah, it's really tricky how to, because there's so much that's valuable here, right? The inversion would be to understand that commons as that which is most high, the divine presence. That which is common to all can only be sacred. It points to nothing beyond itself as symbol to symbol. I'll have to come back later.